20 years after his death, what is Edward Said's legacy? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Adel Iskandar. Adel Iskandar is an associate professor of global communications at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver and co-editor of Jadaliyya. He is, together with Hakim Rustum, co-editor of the book Edward Said, A Legacy of Emancipation and Representation. Adel Iskandar, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you so much, Mouin, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Edward Said passed away 20 years ago on the 25th of September, 2003. How would you characterize his most important intellectual accomplishments? In the introduction to your book, you note that his work traversed borders and disciplines, to quote the introduction. The range of Said's scholarship notwithstanding, I'd nevertheless ask you to identify those elements of his work that have had the most enduring impact.
Thank you, Mouin, for this interview and for this question. I will say that, as you said, Edward Said his loss was an incalculable loss in no small measure, and in a very fundamental way. Said's impact has been, and footprint fundamentally is so enormous and so colossal that it would be very difficult to really sort of condense it into any list of items.
But you're going to give it a shot.
I'll give it a shot as best as one can. And I think we can look at various parameters in various areas where Edward Said's impact continues to be felt to this day, 20 years after his passing. For example, his role in helping us understand what the role of the intellectual is in society is something that traverses all disciplines, all areas of knowledge production, whether it's mediated or in the area of scholarship and research. And I know we're going to get into that eventually in our conversation. Edward Said also helped us understand what the parameters of criticism might look like. What criticism, what the characteristics of criticism might be, whether it's cultural criticism, political criticism, socioeconomic criticism, all those areas he contributed to, and did so with such seamlessness that one could forget that he's had so many other impactful areas. Edward Said also helped us in a very fundamental way understand how to read texts. And by that, I mean like really unpacking discourse and where power is situated when texts are built and created. And by texts, I mean more than just compositional texts, the way we read them, but in the literary tradition, which is where he comes from in literary criticism, but also in mediated texts. His contribution to understanding how media content is constructed and how it overtly expresses power is something that continues to contribute to our understanding of texts. Also, his appreciation of style and aesthetics. This is something that is typically forgotten for those who are interested in his political contribution. We forget that Edward Said was a real sort of student of aesthetics and style and beauty, and he spent a fairly substantial period of his life writing about this. Everything from his writings on Conrad and Wagner, all the way through to his appreciation of other areas of music and literature, and really sort of unpacking the minutiae of what makes something beautiful. And that's a really remarkable contribution of his. He's also helped us understand cosmopolitanism and what it means to be living in exile and outside of one's home. What does home mean? And helping us move beyond strictly defining things. His readings on colonialism and his writings on colonialism, and helping us we often treat Orientalism as the magnum opus, but that and many other works.
What came after it?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. But he's helped us understand what colonialism means. He's contributed to the area, perhaps the progenitor of the area of post-colonial studies. Now it's been rediscussed and rearticulated, but he contributed substantially to decolonization as a practice, building solidarity, thinking about what the difference is between affiliated with a political and social and cultural cause versus filiation, the genealogical attachment to kind of nationalist identity and how problematic that can become. what does it mean to be an amateur? What does it mean to be a virtuoso? Humanism in all of its forms. Really, it's a dizzying contribution for someone. One would think that Edward Said has lived for more than a century, given how much.
Well, on this score, I mean, he rose to prominence within his field, which was literature with the study of Joseph Conrad, but then acquired a global stature through his study of and his publication of the book Orientalism, and then, of course, branched out into numerous other areas.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is for those of us who watched at least part of that journey unfold, yourself included, of course, it seemed circuitous and complicated to follow like Edward Said's journey. But given who he was and where he came from and these sort of formative years in understanding how the world works, it actually made perfect sense. He was
They were all connected in his mind.
Absolutely, absolutely. We use the word polymath kind of loosely to describe people who are interested in different things. I don't think that term really does Edward Said justice. He was fundamentally a cosmopolitan person, both in the intellectual sense and in the personal sense, and really the product of this strange amalgam and cauldron of colonial sort of construction and sort of decolonial practice. And he was really at that cusp and participated in helping us understand what it means to turn decolonization into a vocation.
But if I were to ask you to identify, let's say, two, perhaps three contributions of his that stand out above the others, which would those be?
I would say
on his intellectual work, his scholarship.
I would say helping us understand what secular criticism means. That to me is a very fundamental and very sort of clearly delineated area of Said's work and methodology, if you will, that one could take and transpose to various areas of understanding the world. I would also say kind of the notion of democratic humanism. What does it mean to be democratic, but not in the sort of almost comical and satirical way that we use this language now. And also think, and in a sense, thinking about humanism. What does it mean to be a humanist rather than a human? And it comes from fairly sizable contribution in the area of humanistic arts and also social sciences. And so Edward Said was very keen on making sure that his contributions are seen in light of what they mean for the human condition and thinking beyond one's narrow scope of seeing the world. A universalist, all these terms he also kind of unpacked while he was describing them. So universalism, there's kind of a kumbaya iteration of that. Edward Said's like universalism is on the grounds of
it means something.
Yeah, it must mean something. It can't just be we agree to each other as differences, irrespective of what those differences take us. What does all of this mean? So I would say those two are the anchors in my mind that overarchingly speak to a lot of different areas that Edward Said worked on.
As you've indicated, he saw his intellectual and political work as very much related. Turning now to the political realm, Said was, of course, best known for his advocacy on behalf of the Palestinian people. Yet his political engagement was global in nature, and his advocacy on behalf of Palestine arguably reflected the universal humanism that, as you mentioned, formed the core of his politics, as well as his lifelong engagement with issues of emancipation and representation, to reiterate the title of your book. Against this background, how would you characterize Said's political engagement and influence?
Well, Said was really, again, this is my language, and I know lots of people have strong views and are real sort of followers and adherents and perhaps even disciples of Said's. But I'm going to use my own language. But I think he really was fundamentally a warrior. He was an intellectual warrior. He took the political causes that he stood for quite seriously. He was vociferous in his criticism and adamantly committed to speaking truth to power. I mean, the language may not necessarily be purely his own, but he characterized what it means to be speaking truth to power. And he did so at great disadvantage to himself. And I think that incredible selflessness on his part spoke volumes about what it means to have a political project. He also, in no small measure, and I say this not because the Palestinian cause wasn't at its outset a global political liberation struggle, but Edward Said was able to take the Palestinian cause and truly render it an arena, the singular, most important and critical arena for global decolonial, anti-settler colonial solidarity.
A litmus test, to use his words.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he used it as the litmus test to determine people's loyalties and affiliations, to use his word, with justice, social and political justice.
And I think it would be fair to say that he was able to present it, not so much as having solidarity with an oppressed foreign people, but appealing to our common humanity as the basis for solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Absolutely, and I think one of the it appears to be a political sleight of hand, but I feel it's fairly fundamental core aspect of Said's methodology, that he felt that even the oppressors themselves, the colonizers, those, or at least those who'd subsumed that kind of mode of thinking, were themselves held hostage by that kind of unusual structural arrangement, and that liberation for the colonizers comes from a clear kind of rapture in that relationship, where they disown that sort of kind of non-altruistic, exploitative, extractive relationship. And so for Said, solidarity was such that Palestine was synonymous with every political liberation struggle that exists everywhere and anywhere, and spoke to lots of different areas, like whether it's anti-dogma in the religious institutional sense, or anti-sexist, or anti-misogynist, or anti-racist. It became an ontology. He rendered Palestine an ontological political platform where all other discussions not only fit in, but that Palestine is capable of subsuming all of those struggles, because it is and was and will continue to be at one with them. And so he globalized Palestinian liberation kind of struggles, but also demonstrated what it means for Palestinian liberation to be in solidarity with so many other emancipatory movements against subjugation and criminalization of people.
And to look a bit more closely, he had I'm not sure I would call it a complex relationship with Palestine, but a complex relationship with the Palestinian national movement. Yeah. He, after 1967, was one of its early advocates. Then he wrote in 1979 or 78, I'm not sure, The Question of Palestine, which really remains unequaled, I think, in its ability to speak about Palestine's history and aspirations for self-determination to a Western and particularly American audience, but also was severely criticized in some Palestinian and Arab circles for his open advocacy of a two-state settlement. Then we fast forward to the Oslo agreements, which he bitterly criticized as a capitulation, and at the end of his life was a very eloquent advocate of a one-state solution to the question of Palestine.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Mouin, nobody can speak to this more than you can.
Well, I'm asking you to.
But just to reiterate what you already know and have written about extensively, Said's journey with the Palestinian liberation movement was not only very emotional and deeply personal, but it was also immensely pragmatic. He, in his encounters with Palestine, he was keen on making sure that his relationship was tied to transformations that were happening on the ground. The Israelis have committed, and the Zionists have committed themselves for decades to changing those dynamics. And he made it a point to go back to visit, After the Last Skies. I think After the Last Skies is probably one of my favorite works from Said, where he really sort of encounters the colossal damage and decimation and erasure of Palestinian life and society and territory.
And just to clarify, this was a photographic essay by Jean Moore, to which Said provided the written text. It was a joint project of the two of them.
Absolutely, a truly stellar collaboration, and really a fundamental contribution to not only the narrativization and the retelling of Palestinian stories through their eyes and lens, and in the encounter with land and what happens to land and space, but also a reminder to Said that you can't keep chasing a mirage. The transformations require and necessitate creative, compelling, and deeply humanistic actions that are grounded in solidarity. And so he for some who are deeply adamant in their singular view of how the Palestinian question, if you will, to use Edward Said's language, with the question mark, needs to be addressed or answered. Edward Said was someone who just moved nimbly and malleably through those spaces, recognizing exactly what the repercussions of injustice look like. So the damage done by the PLO, or the Palestinian National Authority, in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, that was damage that he saw as irreparable, that needed to be recalculations, and those
and you could say that his transformation from an advocate of two states to a single democratic state, I think, did reflect a consistency in his view, which is that the basis of any resolution must be equality, and that's precedence over the practical form that it would take.
Absolutely. And I don't think he saw any practical resolution otherwise. Like this was, and it was fundamentally at one with what he has advocated from day one. There was no fundamental contradiction between Edward Said pushing for or seeing the binational state or one state solution as a way to address this incredible injustice, and anything else he'd published previously. When he talks about the Palestinian nationalist liberation movement, he even said, that if there were to ever be a Palestinian state, he will be the first to critique its nationalist project, So this is consistent with the way Edward Said saw nationalism. He saw Israel as a deeply problematic, racist, ultra nationalist state. And the last thing that he wanted was for the Palestinian liberation struggle
to become a mirror image.
Exactly, to mimic that or mirror that. And he believed that fundamentally Palestinian liberation need not follow in those footsteps. And he committed to himself to that. And, the rest of the story, but that's kind of where it was going, I think.
You described him as a warrior, and unlike so many of his peers, Said never shied away from political or intellectual combat. What were some of the most significant debates and controversies he was engaged in during his lifetime?
Oh my goodness, I think Edward Said, I am not like I haven't historicized that relationship, but I would say that shortly after he secured tenure, I think this is where we saw Edward Said sort of coming full. It was a full bloom, right? And he not only did he not shy away from engaging in direct and potentially combative when necessary arguments and contestations, rigid and very, very like sophisticated and meticulously documented critiques of existing kind of power structures. So his debates, for example, with Bernard Lewis, were they appeared to be personal. And in some cases, people become encamped and they see them as ad hominem attacks. But in a very fundamental way, Edward Said was critiquing a massive structural historical contribution by Orientalists that date back, decades, if not longer.
I think Ernest Gellner was another.
Yes, absolutely. And so he saw these individuals as part of a project that needed to be dismantled or at least exposed for its complicity with the colonial project. And so he did that and did so with incredible robustness, gravitas, charisma, and for all intents and purposes, I think he's kind of prevailed in setting the tone and the agenda of those conversations. And there were many other debates along the way as well.
And speaking of ad hominem attacks, he was more often than not on the receiving end of them. One can think particularly of the extraordinarily fraudulent work of Kanaan Makiya and of others.
Absolutely. I mean, because Edward Said was such a towering figure and one who was a beacon for so many others who felt that their voices had long either been forgotten or been buried, he became the target of the ire and the criticism and real sort of, a lot of it very vitriolic and deeply toxic, all the way to the very, very long commentary piece that tried to unpack the history of Edward Said's life and really
basically trying to prove he wasn't Palestinian.
Yeah, trying to prove he's not Palestinian. There's no claim. And in doing so, presumably also make a case against the existence of Palestinians to begin with. That because Said is the most well-known and most reputable Palestinian.
He stood in for the people. And
so you bring down that beacon or you knock down that tower and the whole thing comes crumbling. And he would not take that. And, while he was sick and receiving chemotherapy, fairly strong treatment at the time, he began writing his memoirs, and really that was a definitive and conclusive, I would say, warrior style attack against anyone who dares challenge not only the archival history but the collective memory of Palestinians in their homes and their territories. And we see how that's proliferated now. There's so many incredible Palestinian stories, not unlike what Said wrote about his childhood in Out of Place.
And then there were also the betrayals by people who previously had hung on to his coattails. I'm thinking, for example, of Christopher Hitchens, who in order to ingratiate himself with his new friends in the neocon movement, made some blistering attacks on him even after he had passed away.
Yeah, I feel Edward Said was probably fortunate not to witness some of those that followed. Christopher Hitchens, as you said, is a deeply problematic example. It's a shame because there was a time, George Galloway, who has lots of his own problems, once in a debate with Christopher Hitchens characterized the transformation as the reverse evolution from a butterfly into a slug, or something comical of the sort. But Christopher Hitchens, I think that would have been a fairly devastating kind of realization. There are a few examples of individuals who've collaborated with and stood side by side with Said on the Palestinian liberation struggle that then had a 180-degree turn and became part of, as you said, this neocon project and advocating so fervently for the war in Iraq and other U.S. militaristic interventions. So there are those who've drifted away. I would say that many, I'm not saying that that's true of Christopher Hitchens, but with the passing of Said, there was this incredible sort of collective sense of loss and what does this all mean or where are we going? And so I think it's taken time for people to come to terms not only with his loss, but where to take that project forward. And what does it mean to be Sa'idian, or what does it mean to be kind of following in the footsteps of Said? But he had no shortage of enemies during his life, and I would say that those have probably magnified and multiplied since his passing.
Said, as you noted, had clear ideas about the vocation of public intellectuals, and in fact devoted his 1993 Wreath lectures entitled Representations of the Intellectual to this very topic. How would you characterize his role as a public intellectual, and for that matter, the nature of the campaign against him, even though we've just discussed that latter part in some detail?
Well, so Edward Said's notion of the intellectual has lots of roots and backgrounds, and he understood his role as an intellectual in such a way that he was following in the footsteps of others, and he was building relationships with so many different areas of knowledge production. One who he mentioned quite overtly and quite frequently is Antonio Gramsci. He was deeply committed to the notion of the organic intellectual and what it means to distance oneself from the centers of power and to constantly configure and reconfigure one's relationship and the optics. By optics, I don't mean like the way the world sees you, but rather your own optics of the world, and constantly understand that hegemony is creative, nimble, and capable of adapting, and so we need to adapt in equal measure. And so his commitment to the role of the organic intellectual and constantly identifying where the centers of power are acting and how they're acting and in whose interests, that became a hallmark of his intellectual project. And he took that in the Wreath lectures and elsewhere and began to really operationalize it and render it practical in so many different projects and areas. And whether it's leveling critique against private media that are in cahoots with major sort of industrial and militarized establishments, or it's working to challenge the role of autocratic governments in the Middle East that claim to carry the mantle of nationalist liberation. So that role of the organic intellectual in Said's mind was one that required a constant, scanning, adapting, understanding the lay of the land, but also constantly being at odds with those in power. So speaking truth to power is, it sounds like it's a bunch of singular terms, that power exists in a singular form, but power also manifests in different ways. And so being able to figure out where one's situated in relation to power, but also in relation to justice movements. So I think that became the core of his intellectual contribution and his criticism of how the intellectual should be represented.
And he also saw the successful public intellectual as an amateur.
Oh, absolutely.
Rather than someone who was, let's say, part and parcel of these structures that they were supposed to hold to account.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that term, because that is a very central term in Said's understanding of intellectualism, because for the most part, intellectuals, or at least the traditional intellectual, to use also Gramsci's term of the oppositional, not the non-oppositional intellectual, is one
state intellectual.
Yeah, this in that circumstance, you've got kind of upward mobility, hierarchy, and the more situated the intellectual is vis-a-vis those centers of power, the more beneficial that relationship is, and they distance them, they become professionalized. And so moving away from professionalization and recognizing what it means to be amateur. I think when we use the word amateur in popular kind of usage, there's the assumption that an amateur, that nobody wants to be an amateur.
That an amateur is ignorant.
Exactly, ignorant, or maybe kind of naive, or doesn't have the skill set necessary to be able to execute on a particular task. But for Said, amateurism meant independence, freedom to operate outside of the structures in place, being able to see where those openings and crevices are, where one could actually like level that critique, being able to rise above the majoritarian views or that kind of cacophonous noise that dictates what is and isn't right. So that is very, very deeply rooted. And I think a lot of it comes from his understanding of exile and his experience of exile. When you're in exile, you are almost equipped with the tools potentially that could be utilized and rendered into an amateur project of intellectual contribution.
Because you are, in a sense, a permanent outsider.
Absolutely. And this is a beautiful part of Said's work. And, I don't know if it'll come back again, but Said went from telling us about the trauma of being an outsider to really empowering us to see this place of being an outsider as a source of incredible power and a source of resilience and a way to instrumentalize critique. And that's where the amateur comes into the intellectual role.
Compared to other critics of power, and particularly imperial power, like his close friends and associates, Noam Chomsky and Iqbal Ahmed, Said had fairly extensive access to the mainstream media. Like Chomsky, he also wrote extensively on how the media and its leading pundits serve power and promote imperial agendas. In his case, he did it with a particular emphasis, of course, on the Middle East. How would you characterize Said's relationship with and to the media?
Well, as someone who studies the media quite extensively, I was always quite amazed at Edward Said's remarkable acuity. And even though he's, someone who encountered media perhaps at a slightly, later stage in his life, early stages of life, he was really kind of talking about how the photograph is this deeply problematic way of documenting life. He talks about his family and family photographs and how the process of representation is a deeply violent one because it almost always leaves something outside the frame. And then you see his writings on, covering Islam, for instance, which is really a very, very sharp and pointed critique against the media establishment.
And it came out around the time of the Islamic Revolution in Iran.
Exactly. And how that was characterized and described. And, the whole sort of embassy debacle, the US embassy in Tehran debacle that unfolded at the time. For listeners who want to pursue that, there's lots of little kind of details here and there that they can seek and understand better. But this was his way of saying, you know what? I see what the media is all about. I see what, corporate media looks like and the way it's unfolding. And there's an alternative to that. And in those circumstances, I can see a synergy between, let's say, what Chomsky writes in Manufacturing Consent or other works that are a critique of the media establishment. There is definitely a connection there. But Edward Said was deeply committed to ensuring that despite the mainstream media's myopia and intentional blind spotting of Palestine and the Middle East, that he needed to offer that corrective voice because nobody else was stepping up, and that he was going to use whatever clout, respect, fame, whatever it is that you want to call it, to try and break that incredible chorus, that monotonous chorus. And there are many instances where Edward Said talks about how he's writing all these letters to the editors of newspapers and publications that are either getting turned away or rejected, and they would just keep bouncing back. And so here you've got this incredibly, successful and reputable and sought after, academic and public intellectual, and the mainstream media are literally blocking him out, So he knew that it was necessary to have those conversations on those platforms because he understood that those are the ones reaching the larger proportions of the population. He wanted to popularize critiques of power in those institutions. And he did have those, breaks here and there, like an article in a letter to the editor in the New York Times, but they were few and far between. For someone who had such an oversized contribution to knowledge production. The media remained, for the most part, his nemesis. The mainstream media remained his nemesis, even though he made numerous attempts to kind of break that. And of course, that became a critique of the media. Like, what are the media doing or not doing to ensure that these stories, these narratives, these experiences from the Middle East, from Palestine, are forgotten? And, it's 2023 now. We still are having the same conversation of why there's so few, Palestinian voices or voices that reflect the critique of the U.S.
Well, you speak of Palestine, but one of the last issues in the Middle East about which he addressed particularly the U.S. Media treatment of it was, of course, the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003, only months before his death.
Yeah, I mean, this was, I think that remains the single most catastrophic performance on the part of the US media in the last maybe half century, if not longer.
Since the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, it's but I mean, it really was quite incredible how the mainstream media in the US drummed up public support for, and it was very much a perfect storm of, anyway, for those who are interested in it, this, and Edward Said watched this. It's a shame that, his last year was watching this kind of post 9/11, anti-terrorism, war on terror kind of narrative get whipped up into an incredible frenzy and be instrumentalized in such a way to target the Middle East, various areas in the Middle East, notwithstanding what, the complete destruction of the Iraqi society, that continues to, bleed to this day. But Edward Said witnessed this unfold, and it really spoke to a lot of the things that he stood for and the critiques that he was advocating for. But such was the state of media. Luckily, today we can have those conversations about that because of how catastrophic the war effort has been, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in other US militarized misadventures around the region and the world. But still, that was Edward Said's contribution before that moment came to be. And that's really why his work continues to be relevant, because even though it may be speaking to a moment, it is also very much outside of that temporal limitation. It really is a general state of being, unfortunately, for the mainstream media.
I feel this discussion wouldn't be complete without addressing the use and abuse of Said's work by others, whether Islamists and other purveyors of identity politics or academics determined to concoct increasingly incomprehensible formulations to express grand theories neither they nor anyone else will ever understand. I've always felt that Said's writings, particularly his Culture and Imperialism, should be understood as a forceful challenge to nativism, and that one reason for his influence was his clarity of expression. How do you see this issue, and to what extent does Said bear responsibility for the uses to which his work has been put by others?
Oh, okay, that last part is a twist. Okay, I think it's fair to say, and I'll take a step back by saying that Edward Said is a lot of things to a lot of different people, and I think it's difficult and hard for anyone to really kind of take ownership of Said's project and claim that it serves this purpose as opposed to others. Having said that, it is nevertheless really important to understand that Edward Said cannot be read in fragments, cannot be understood in the same way that his oeuvre, if you will, was a substantial contribution to so many areas of knowledge. As a polymath, as a cosmopolitan, there are so many different steps and stages in his thinking. They all contribute to a larger picture. But if one were to abridge Said and read like a single passage here or a single quote there, nowadays we're in the age of digital media, so Edward Said may be found kind of reduced to a single tweet, like a quote here or a quote there. So not only is Edward Said very frequently being taken out of context, he is also being deployed purposefully by different groups to serve their respective purposes. So one thing is fundamental, whether it's Islamists or ultra nationalists or wherever people happen to be on a spectrum. Edward Said committed himself to the critique of dogma in all of its forms. And so if you are using Said to make a case for kind of a rigid interpretation of the law that serves a singular community in the same way that you described, perhaps a nativistic kind of argument in favor of a particular group and at the expense of others, that is a catastrophic misreading and really a complete disowning of Said's project. And if Said were, around and he did this quite meticulously during his life, he would very often say, no here, no there, this doesn't reflect this. In fact, many people don't know that even post-colonial studies, an area that he, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and others contributed to creating, he very much distanced himself from. He refused to use terms like post-colonial scholar because he saw the way in which theoretical schools and conceptual understandings can become extremely limited once we render them an identity. So a political project is a political project that serves a common cause, not one that serves the cause of others at the expense of others. So I think that is a really, really critical part of Said. I would encourage anyone who is using Said for any personal, political, social, cultural, economic kind of function to really try to understand where Said is coming from theoretically, to see if there is fidelity in that relationship that is being built. So I think that's kind of an overarching problem. Having said that, Edward Said is not only misquoted and misunderstood, he is also being used to advocate for deeply problematic ideologies, political projects. I mean, Said was a secular critic. You can't like build an argument in favor of an Islamic system of governance or a Judeo-Christian.
You've misread 2 pages of Orientalism.
Absolutely. And also like for instance, the representations of covering Islam. Covering Islam is a critique of the Western media establishment's presentation of the Islamic Republic, but
it's not an advocacy on behalf of the regime in Tehran.
Exactly. And there's no circumstance where the liberation of colonial states is a pass for authoritarian governments that carry the flag of nationalist liberation. So,
and you've also made the point that, living in the West, he was, of course, most exposed to attacks by Zionists and pro-Israeli figures and servants of American imperial power. But as you've pointed out, in fact, the criticism and condemnation of him was much wider than that, emanating from numerous quarters, precisely for the reasons you've just stated.
Absolutely. I think, depending on one's kind of purview or angle, you'll see that criticism is leveled at Said because he doesn't reflect a particular worldview that is consistent with the ideologies that he sometimes advocates for good reason and critiques for others. So the fact that he's exilic and is not easily situated theoretically allows those individuals and those groups and those communities and those political projects to take what they want and discard the rest. And that really kind of doesn't work. So for example, there are Zionist groups that look upon Edward Said's kind of late life and his work with the West Eastern Divan to make a case for kind of a normalization that
this is the orchestra composed of young musicians from the Middle East that he established together with Daniel Barenboim.
Yes, absolutely. And so this project, which brings together young students of classical music from that are Palestinian, that are Jewish Israeli, but from other parts of the Arab world, was an attempt to unite with music, but also to have a curriculum that really thinks about and tries to address colonial history, settler colonial history, and how it's been industrialized, and how to move beyond that by building common relationships, that people need to see each other at a time when the apartheid wall had created massive rifts between two populations that can no longer see each other beyond through the barrel of a gun. And so Said wanted to disrupt that. And in that disruption alone, you could see how that singular project can become a deeply problematic one in the eyes of so many different individuals, including many who are allies of Said. They're like, oh, this is not acceptable. How could you do such a thing? But nevertheless, it still remains consistent with everything he's ever written. It is not a Said transforming or morphing or becoming anyone else. It is still consistent. When he teaches the Nakba, he also teaches the Holocaust. And it is necessary for those. It doesn't mean that the Palestinians are responsible for the circumstance, the plight and of Jews in Europe, but nevertheless, that those histories need to be understood in tandem. And
because he saw them as intertwined.
Absolutely, inextricably, which is the best way to put it. Like there is no way out of this intertwinement. And so with the intertwinement means that the resolution has to be, or the discussion about justice needs to be by all counterparts, all interactants, all actors. And that's why it becomes so controversial. And that's why Said remains a lightning torch to this day for so many different political projects that don't necessarily, that see eye to eye with him on certain aspects of his work, but the rest they will either conveniently or lazily set aside to avoid any further confrontation.
In conclusion, Edward Said passed away 20 years ago next week. 2 decades after his death, he remains a point of reference, an intellectual and political beacon in numerous fields and arenas. He's ranged from subaltern studies in South Asia to literary criticism, post-colonial theory, promotion of a one-state solution in Palestine. As a final thought, how would you define his legacy and lasting influence?
I would say his defining it. I mean, I think this is the hardest question.
Characterize.
No, it's not because I can't do it. It's because Said fundamentally defied definition. And I think maybe that is the best way to characterize it. He defied definition, and yet despite that, he became the definition of contemporary social justice as an intellectual project.
I think that's extremely well put.
Yeah.
Adel Iskandar, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much, Mouin. And I want to thank you for talking to me about this, but I also would encourage so many people to engage in conversations about Said. I can't believe it's been 20 years. It's a very, very sad day, but it's also a good opportunity to commemorate and to celebrate and to recognize this remarkable human being and the contribution that he's made to our lives and to our societies. And I hope the conversation can continue.
Yes, and on that score, please consult Jadaliyya's website, www.jadaliyya.com, next Monday, when we will be publishing a trove of materials on and about Edward Wadi'a Said. Thanks once again.
Thank you.